now go on to the Control of Economic Activity, Occupied Territory Bill, Committee stage. Section 1. Question is that Section 1 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed? Agreed. Section 2. That Section 2 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Please, could I have quietness in the chamber? That Section 3 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
That Section 4 stand part of the bill. Is that agreed?
Can I speak on Section 3?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Please, thank you.
Section 4, yeah.
Thank you.
Section 3 or Section 4?
Section 3.
3, okay,
Section
sorry.
3.
Yes, that's okay. You're quite entitled, yeah.
And
Right, lad.
is that okay? Can I start?
Yes.
I just want to welcome the Minister to the House today, and I will try and be as brief as I can, but this is an important section, and I feel that I need to make sure that people understand, because I know there's been a lot of questions around Section 3. So Section 3 mirrors the one before it in that our aim is to focus solely on international law. While much of the debate has covered Israel's 50-year occupation of the West Bank, relentless settlement construction and the devastating human rights consequences that result, colleagues will see that this section of the bill is drafted generally. This is vitally important. It means that it can only apply to occupations and breaches of international law anywhere in the world, if the evidence and legal consensus is there. So, as you know, I'm deeply passionate about the human rights of the Palestinian people, and I think back to doing charity gigs for Gaza in 2014 and my devastation at what was happening. But I firmly believe that the same standards should apply everywhere. I could have drafted a bill relating only to Israel and Palestine, but I actually fully agree with those who say it shouldn't just be about any one conflict. It's about the rules of international law, applicable anywhere, and a commitment from Ireland that if we are sure those laws are being broken, if we are sure certain goods are produced as a result of war crimes, then we won't support that. Ireland also cannot, nor would we want to, adjudicate on the status of every occupation or conflict in the world. Instead, we set a neutral, objective standard that relies on international law and the decisions of the international courts listed. Here we set a high bar, based firmly on international law. The reason Israel-Palestine is covered from the outset is precisely because of the overwhelming international legal consensus that the settlements violate international law. This is the long-standing consistent position of the Irish Government, the EU, the UN and the International Court of Justice. But I agree with colleagues across the House, and I would absolutely welcome further rulings of those courts. I think a strong case can be made in relation to Western Sahara, for example. As such, recognising that individual colleagues may feel passionate about a particular occupation and feel that international courts are moving too slowly, Sections 3 and 4 give us the capacity to include other territories and move ahead of those court rulings. If there is agreement between the Seanad, the Dáil and the Minister, there is a reasonable standard working on the basis of court judgments and strong consensus in the Oireachtas. So, given the confusion there has been there on this, I want to say very clearly, we are not singling out any state. No individual state is mentioned anywhere in this bill. Instead, we rely on the clear decisions of international courts as respected arbiters of international law.
Thank you. Before I call the next speaker, I'm sure that the members of the House will wish to join with me in welcoming a parliamentary delegation from France, led by Deputy Paul Mullock, President of the France-Ireland Parliamentary Friendship Group. On my own behalf, on behalf of all my colleagues in Shannon, I extend a very warm welcome to you and good wishes for a very successful trip to Ireland. The next speaker is Senator Joe O'Reilly.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. And at the outset, could I just briefly join with your welcome to our delegation of French parliamentarians. I had the privilege and pleasure of meeting them for conversations on a number of issues earlier, and it was a great pleasure. There are long historic ties and of friendship between our two countries. There are a number of things of clear issues that we need to put on the record of the House before we approach the specifics of the legislation. I want no ambiguity as to the position of my party and of the government in relation to the occupied territories. We want to return to the pre-6 Day War boundaries. We want the accelerated rate of occupations which has taken place over the years 2017, 2018. We want that accelerated rate of occupations to stop. We are not supporters in any fashion of the occupation of these territories, and I personally feel very passionate about that, that we unquestionably empathise and condemn and have no truck with the suffering of Palestinian people. And I am aware...
To interrupt, it sounds a bit like a second stage speech, and I'm just wondering if we can speak to the section.
It's relevant to the section, and I understand the chair will rule, but my understanding is that we can speak in this at this stage
on the section, yeah.
Yes, on generally, the section, and generally.
We'll allow you, and if it goes on too long, I might consider what.
Well, we'll be moving on to the specifics as we go. But this is relevant anyway. It's extraordinarily relevant, and as we approach and take a position on a section, there has to be a clear understanding as to why. So, that's our position on the occupied territories. We're also in favour of the two-state solution, and that's been pursued vigorously by Minister Coveney, or Taoiseach Coveney as he now is, right across since the beginning of his work in company or in tandem with Minister Cannon here in that department. There is an ongoing concerted effort to achieve the two-state solution, to get the peace process back on the rails. We also have a strong issue with the shooting of Palestinians in the recent strikes, and we're completely abhorred by that and the shooting dead of any people. And minors going to adult courts, being separated from parents in the middle of the night, all of that litany of human rights abuses we have a huge problem with. We have a huge problem and an opposition to the rate of unemployment, the skyrocketing unemployment, the low per capita income, the breakdown of infrastructure in terms of roads, water, power, etc. So we are unambiguously, unequivocally against that and in favour of the Palestinian people there. So let there be no illusions about that. So we condemn Israeli expansion, and we have supported a number of EU measures in sanctioning Israel for those settlements, for the expansion of those settlements. Those have included excluding settlement goods from normal tariff rates, ensuring accurate labelling of settlement goods, and so that could be represented as coming from Israel, and consumers could make a choice for themselves, which ultimately has to be the ultimate yardstick. You will be aware, of course, that, and indeed Senator Black has very graciously and never fails to graciously acknowledge this, that Taoiseach Coveney has been in liaison with Senator Black right through this process, understands the objectives she's trying to achieve, and it's a question of how to arrive at the same objectives, and therein lies the issue. The government is opposing the bill on the following technical grounds, and this is Section 3.
Yeah, but I want to be careful with it. I don't want to. You can always come back in at other sections or towards the end of the bill, but I don't want to have you to make a full second stage speech on Section 3.
Yeah. Would it be in order, just here, look, if I go through the technical reasons?
Please.
This is a classic filibuster.
Oh, it's not. Oh, no.
I spoke in the other house.
Please.
I spoke in the other
Senator Norris is unaccustomed to
filibustering, and I said, yes, I am.
Please.
It's a perfectly legitimate political...
Senator Norris, please. Senator Norris, please resume your seat. Senator Norris, please resume your seat. Please resume your seat. That's not a point of order. You're being very disobedient of the chair.
Yes.
I'll allow you continue, but contain yourself to the section.
Yes, sure. And it was important that I gave a context. I don't think that was very short. One could have gone into every subsection of that much more. But it was essentially stating our principle, our philosophical position, our policy, and that was an important context. So we oppose the difficulty that we have with the bill is on the it's on the following. The bill. The bill
I think he's about to finish, so
yes,
let him.
The bill requires the government to do something which is not in its power. External trade, including the control of goods entering the EU single market, is an exclusive EU competence.
The relevant occupied territory.
It's about the importation.
No, it's not. It's completely irrelevant.
No, it's more time to interrupt you, delaying
to decide that.
Allow Senator Riley to conclude.
So, goods from Israeli settlements can only be excluded at EU level, not by an individual member state, but as a collective. And it would expose, this is the nub of the issue, and I'm sure there's nobody in the House would want this. It would expose the state. The best advice we get from the Attorney General's office and from general legal advice is that it would expose the state to the risk of legal actions. It would expose the state to legal action not just by Israel but by anyone claiming to be affected by the bill, and would likely lead to substantial and recurring damages against our. No, it's particularly pertinent this is not a course that any government would want to take. So I'll leave it at that now. We'll come back to that more substantially at section 6 then, in deference. Thanks.
For want of any accusations, I'd like to just briefly welcome the Minister of the House, and also as convener of the French-Irish Friendship Group, I'd like to echo your welcome to the delegation from the National Assembly in France. My question is relevant to. I have a couple of points relevant to Section 3 specifically, and in relation to the first part of Section 3. And I welcome the comments by Senator Black when she said that this was about a wider issue, and her deliberate reference to Western Sahara is of course welcome. But I would have a concern over other disputed regions which are quite obvious, but due to various roles within, be it the International Criminal Court, or the vagueness where it says an international tribune. I don't know exactly how that can apply. And this third area is, of course, the will of the minister. Now, this is something that could depend on the government of the day. Does the government breach international rulings to cite what is a conflict area? And I suppose that some of it comes into the second part of this section when it says all territories. And I suppose that the easiest way to discuss this is to give the practical example, and it was very obvious on the front page of the Irish Times yesterday when we look at the Odessa region in Ukraine, where we cannot get a combined ruling of the United Nations Security Council because we have the constant fear of a Russian veto. And therefore, it brings into the whole question of the disputed territory. What is an occupied territory? And whilst I do not want to take away from the meaning and potential benefits of this bill, I do have a concern that it is open for abuse and that there is a vagueness in that part of this section of the bill that I'd really appreciate, if the Minister could outline whether or not this is actually something that can be watertight enough for the government to stand over in its interpretation of what exactly is an occupied territory. Because yesterday's occupied territory might be a liberated nation. Tomorrow's liberated nation might become an occupied territory. I think it is something that I would like clarity on. I don't necessarily oppose it or reject it, but it's just something that under a reading of international law, I think that could possibly be opened up to abuse by future governments, possibly.
Carly, and welcome to the Minister, and indeed, as has been said, our many visitors in the public gallery tonight. In relation to this section, it's really just to reaffirm and restate what Senator Black has said in relation to the definition here, that this isn't about singling out. This is about marking clearly those breaches of international law which constitute what is contained in the bill is indeed very straightforward. And I would refer people to the legal advice that France has gotten, has published, is there for all to see. I think it's a great shame that, to my knowledge, the government at this stage hasn't published their own legal advice that is prohibiting them from supporting this bill. I also note the remarks and the input from our Seanad colleague, Senator Madole, in relation to this and his own advice that this is in no way a breach of either international law, but I think most importantly it in no way breaches domestic state law. And I think, as has been said, I won't prolong my own contribution, but as Francis, I think, has outlined very clearly, this in no way targets individual states or entities. This is very clear in terms of adhering and compelling us to adhere to international law and to stop, cease, desist the sale or the purchase, should I say, of goods and services from illegal settlements, from what constitute war crimes under international law, and by continuing or by turning a blind eye or by enabling the purchasing of goods and services, we are effectively continuing to enable apartheid. And that, as I said at the earlier stage of this debate, is a shameful position for this state. It's a shameful position for this government. We should adhere to the legal advice that is given to us. We should not be afraid of it, and we should not be afraid of the democratic will and mandate expressed by this House.
Thank you. Senator O'Sullivan.
I don't want to make a second stage speech or anything, but it's my first speech on this issue since I became Fianna Fáil spokesman on foreign affairs, so if you give me a small bit of leeway, it's important for my party that we outline exactly what our position is on this, and I welcome the bill and I commend Senator Black and her colleagues for introducing it. And we, Fianna Fáil, have decided to support the bill at second stage and again at committee stage. I'm supporting the section. My party have held a long-held interest in Middle East peace process, and it was a Fianna Fáil-led government, indeed, who was the first member state of the EU to propose the two-state solution. In supporting the bill and the section, we are very conscious of the wrongs that are being committed by both sides, and it is certainly not our intention to alienate Israel or its allies. We fully support Israel's right to self-determination and self-defence, and we further believe, and I want to say it on the record, that we believe there is an onus on the Palestinian Authority to act responsibly in its interactions with Israel and to do all it can to prevent attacks on the Israeli people. Notwithstanding that, we are deeply frustrated by the lack of progress towards the two-state solution. We believe that the continued expansion of illegal settlements on Palestinian land and the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and the West Bank cannot be allowed to continue. It was the late Brian Lenihan Sr. In 1980 who unequivocally stated that the Palestinian people had a right to self-determination and to an independent state in Palestine, and that remains key policy of my party to this day. We also respect the State of Israel and its undisputed right to self-determination and self-defence. Attacks on Israel and incitement to violent action is unacceptable to us. However, we cannot support the continuous building by Israelis on Palestinian land, a project which has proven to be totally disastrous for the peace process. Just one or two more points. I think since I took on this brief and since this motion was flagged, I have been inundated by messages of support for the Palestinian position. I welcome and I respect all these communications, but I have heard almost nothing whatsoever in support of Israel. And it's my personal opinion that Israel seems to have a serious public relations problem in that regard. There are two sides to every story, as we know. And while I'm in this brief, I intend to look at both sides and to make a fair assessment on it. There is a pro-Palestinian consensus in this country, which I'm not part of, and I'm not one who wants to blame the State of Israel for everything. It is worth recalling, that the people of Israel, the Jewish nation, have undergone suppression and abuse, and they have to endure behaviour that I think no other nation in the history of this world have had to endure. and even ourselves in our long history of imperial repression by the British, all that sad story of our own pales into insignificance when you put it up against the Holocaust and the travails of the Jewish people over centuries. And it's not too much to hope that the Israeli people would, at this late stage, be allowed to have a home in peace and in security. And I'm calling on both sides of the conflict to take it more seriously in relation to they all profess to believe in the two-nation theory, but in practice we don't see a sign of it from either side. So with those opening remarks, Cathaoirleach, I'll conclude.
Thank you. Senator McDowell, did you wish to come in?
Well, briefly, just on the section, I believe that what Senator Black has said on the section is correct. I believe that the definition of occupied territory is not related to one particular corner of this planet, and I believe that it's of general application, and I do believe that it is perfectly legitimate for the Irish state to uphold international law by rendering the importation of goods and the supply of services located in unlawfully occupied territory a criminal offence, especially when the occupation itself amounts to a war crime, it being the case that under the various international conventions it is a war crime to move population into territory which is not your own territory with a view to its permanent settlement.
Thank you. Senator Norris.
Thank you very much. First of all, may I say I listened with horror to the debate between Francis Black and Alan Shatter. Alan Shatter's an old school pal of mine, a bit of a chum, but his language was appalling. It was grotesquely intemperate. I mean, he talked about this debate and this bill as being full of hatred, rage, and racism. Absolute rubbish. Now, to the matter, I think it's already been rehearsed. I imagine it has in the few minutes before I got into the chamber. The various legal authorities that have attested to the appropriateness of this bill: Michael Lynn, Professor James Crawford, our own Senator Michael McDowell, former Minister for Justice, former Attorney General, and so on. And this has been added to by a very renowned authority, Professor Takis Tridimus. So I'll put that all to one side. But what I cannot put to one side is the evidence coming to me from Israel, from within the Jewish Israeli community. I have in my hand here a letter from Ambassador Ilan Baruch, and this is what he says about it. It is our view that this unique piece of legislation will help enhance differentiation between the State of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, where illegal settlements are currently benefiting from economic relations maintained with Irish and other EU firms. He goes on to say this: our petition comes with a sense of urgency, as further evictions and demolitions of Palestinian residential and commercial buildings in East Jerusalem are taking place. Palestinians are being evicted from their homes in the neighbourhood of Silwan, while settlers are moving in. At the same time, the government authorised the construction of 800 new housing units for Israelis in occupied East Jerusalem. With this in mind, we believe that the Control of Economic Activity Occupied Territories Bill 2018 can play a pivotal role in upholding international law and the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2334, and will contribute to the creation of the necessary conditions on the ground for a just and lasting peaceful resolution of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Now, I strongly supported the State of Israel over many years. I could paper my library walls. In fact, they are papered with trees given to me by the people of Israel in my name because of the work I did for them. But I reserve the right to equally strongly criticise them, whether in gross violation of human rights. And I would say this directly to you, Minister, and through you to the Senior Minister. In a former government, a former minister, Rory Quinn, was faced with a situation when he was given advice by the then Attorney General Peter Sutherland that this was against European Union law, and he defied it. He had the courage to defy that, and I call upon you to defy the same defective advice that you're being given by the Attorney General.
Leyden.
Welcome Minister Cannon to the House, and thank you for coming in. And just say that, as my colleague Senator Sullivan said, we in Fianna Fáil are supporting this bill. I would like to welcome Deputy Niall Collins, our spokesperson in the Dáil on Foreign Affairs, to the House. And indeed, he has been very supportive and indeed helpful in the sense that we have made a decision as a parliamentary party last July, and we made a decision on the basis of the situation, the oppression of the Palestinian people in the West Bank and particularly in Gaza. I'd like to welcome very much the ambassador from Palestine here, and indeed the people who are lobbying and indeed activists in this country. Ireland has a long and honourable tradition as far as Palestine is concerned. And I'm very proud of the fact, and as my colleague said, that Brian Lenihan was the first minister in the European Union to recognise the self-determination of the Palestinian people in harmony and have a two-state solution. That is the only solution that will work in that region. And I must say that the activities by the President of America, particularly in moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, is most divisive and most unhelpful in that particular regard. Now, in 2003, I initiated and started the Friends of Palestine in the Oireachtas, and in fact it was the largest number of Oireachtas members ever to put their names to a group that were Friends of Palestine. And I must say, I don't wish to mention the President, but the Chair was our President Michael D. Higgins, who played a very pivotal role in foreign affairs in the Oireachtas. And it has and that's why I'm delighted that Senator Black is bringing this bill and our colleagues, because it is important, and it's important to highlight the situation as well. It gives an opportunity for this House to remind ourselves again of the oppression of the Palestinian people. And on the section, I know that it's occupied territories that we're talking about, but let's refer specifically to the occupied Palestine. Now, we could talk about Crimea, we could talk about other parts of the world which are occupied as well, but I'm specifically interested in this particular region. I was there, I led a delegation on the Dáil and Seanad, and to see, and occupied, on dealing with the section, occupied territory in that particular regard is literally occupied. It's occupied by the building of a 30-foot wall, it's occupied by fences. The beautiful city of Bethlehem is surrounded by a massive wall. I mean, the people there are crying out for justice, actually, and that's why we in this House, and that's why I'm delighted that this Senate was retained by the Irish people, because it is an opportunity, it's a forum to speak out on behalf of people who are persecuted in that region. And when I was in that region, when I led the delegation to that at that time, I was appalled to see it on the ground, these occupied areas and these settlements, all built to a certain design: white, red roofs, swimming pools where water is scarce, and actually the storage system being poured down on the Palestinian farmers. I was absolutely appalled the way they were being treated, and that's why we have to take a stand. I would like to see the European Union taking a stand. All the other 26 countries with ourselves and Britain as well, to take a stand in this particular regard. And the French delegation was in. They're a country that's very important. Human rights is very important indeed. Just to say as well, I think I should mention as well, talking about Friends of Palestine, there was no greater friend than former Senator McLanigan from Kilkenny, who was the leading spokesperson here in this House, and was recognised by the Palestinian people with a special recognition. Now, dealing with the section again, I think the bill is not unconstitutional or not against law, and the Attorney General should review this, because it doesn't specifically mention the occupied areas of Palestine. So it's a general bill that relates to areas that are occupied throughout the world. But to see firsthand, and I'd recommend to our colleagues in this House, people who have never went to Israel, went to Palestine, went through Tel Aviv. Actually, just to give an example, I was wearing a Palestinian Irish badge on my lapel, and I was stopped at the airport. I was practically refused admission into Israel because I had this badge. And I said, "Where did you get it from?" I said, "I got it from the Palestinian people. I support the Palestinian people." But that being said, I want to say just to say that we'll be supporting this bill. I know that the mover, Senator Black, is anxious to get it through, so I won't be making any more contribution to this bill. I only said that categorically we are supporting it, and this bill will be passed by this House tonight.
Rockwell.
I just rise to congratulate Senator Black for bringing forward this bill and her colleagues. This is, as has been pointed out, it's not about two countries, it's about an occupied area, an illegally occupied area. I wish to state at the outset that I do not necessarily condemn everything Israel does. They too are entitled to protect themselves, and they have rockets coming over from Hamas, but sometimes the response is above and beyond anything you would expect. They have destroyed Gaza for all intents and purposes. The bottom line on it is they're in an area that they shouldn't be. Any economic activity that they generate from that should not be purchased by the people in the European Union. Senator Black's bill will not send shockwaves through the Israeli people or through the Israeli government, but it might provide a lead for the rest of the European Union to follow. And it is only through action like that that you can get some sort of reaction from a state that has lost the run of itself. We're talking about breaching international law here. So I will support Senator Black on this. I won't speak on the bill again, but I will support all of the bill. Thank you.
Minister Alice Mary Higgins.
Simply to address some of the concerns raised by Senator Richmond, just to clarify that in respect of international tribunal, it is the definition of international tribunal under the 4th Geneva Convention. So I know there was a concern of what that definition might be. I think we're very safe in regards to that. All of this language and that language is taken from the 4th Geneva Convention, would of course look to the precedent in relation to that. In respect to 3D, which is the capacity of a minister, just to maybe clarify, I think it's interesting you mentioned Ukraine, because there is some interesting precedent in terms of the European Union, including Ireland, taking quite serious actions, far beyond, in fact, the scope of this bill in respect of Crimea, in response to an issue in respect of Ukraine in the past. D is, I would suggest, and maybe this short circuits our need to discuss it at great length, under Section 4, the regulations, very kind of lengthy regulations are set out as to how D would be determined. I think there's no danger of ministerial abuse, because the minister would have to go through both houses of the Oireachtas and have the approval of both houses. So it certainly wouldn't be solely at the discretion of a minister. However, I imagine that if further safeguards were to be sought, I'm sure that that's something that could be looked at report stage in terms of amendments to Section 4. However, what I think is really being sought here is, in fact, to give scope, appropriate scope and leadership to the government, and in fact that section is there to allow that both the government and the houses of the Oireachtas are free to respond in situations such as those which you've outlined before. So I think it is very well thought through in that, and I would simply add, we will have an opportunity to discuss e-law and trade law later. The legal preponderance of eminent, not just Irish, but international and globally eminent legal opinion is very clear that this is within the European law. Again, we are talking about global experts who are not simply been cited by our own Supreme Court, but by the International Court of Justice. Lastly, I would just add, this is not solely about one area. This is not solely even about the concerns people may have around illegal occupation in Palestine. This is around international law in the widest sense too. For example, Western Papua may well have a case taken to the International Court of Justice in the future, and that is something that's been talked about. It is around Ireland's commitment to international law, as well as any perspective we may have on a conflict. It is more about our commitment to international law, something I think we've always tried to stand up for. and I think it's important to keep that wider perspective as well. Thank you.
Senator O'Riordan.
The Labour Party supports this bill and supported it at the last stage. I congratulate Senator Black and the Civil Engagement Group for bringing the bill forward. Whenever we speak in this chamber of the rise of right-wing rhetoric and populism across the world, countries are listed such as America, the UK, Hungary, Poland, Italy. Nobody ever mentions Israel, but remarkably, from a pretty low base, they've managed to, in the last number of years, make things even worse. The Jewish people, the proud people, wherever they have been, have always been viewed as the enemy within, and they have a proud community where I live as well, and a Jewish cemetery around the corner from where I live, a proud people viewed as the enemy within, a reviled people, and yet that is exactly what they are doing to the Palestinian people. They view them as the enemy within. And that's why we support this bill. That's why we'll continue to support the Palestinian people, and that's why we will continue to join with others to ensure that Israel eventually is treated as South Africa was in the past. And that's the only way, I believe, by collective international action, that they will change their attitudes and change their view and their practices in terms of their outright disgraceful treatment of international law.
Minister, do you wish to come in, or do you want to wait till the end? Or? Okay. The question, so the Section 3 stand part of it, is that agreed? Agreed. Not agreed. The question is that Section 3 stand part of the bill. Those in favour say tá. Those against say níl. I think the question is carried. Vote on.
Economic Activity Occupied Territories Bill 2018. Committee stage Section 3. The question is that Section 3 stand part of the bill, and on that question the division has been challenged. Tillers Taw, Senator Francis Black and Senator Alice Mary Higgins. Neil, Senator John O'Mahony and Senator Joe O'Reilly, and the vote will take place over 1 minute starting now. Section 20, the Section 3 stand part of the bill. Tá 29, that's increased from 28. I think my illustrious colleague forgot to press a button. And Neil 14, so the question is carried.
Section 4.
Section 4.
The Minister.
Oh, I must wait for the Minister, yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Section 4 stand part of the bill. Yes. Agreed. Agreed. Thank you. Section 5. The Section 5 stand part of the bill. Agreed. Thank you. Section 6. The Section 6 stand part of the bill. Agreed. Sorry. Senator Richmond, are you indicating?
I believe it's Senator O'Reilly then myself.
Senator O'Reilly, are you indicating on Section 6?
Yes.
Right.
Just bear with. Sorry, I just want to get something. Can you take Senator Richmond to get something?
Senator Richmond.
Sorry, I had one question. Firstly, I had hoped to speak to section 4, but you didn't see my hand, but that's neither here nor there. I did actually, but anyway, without interruption, Senator Norris, I would just like to use that to thank Senator Higgins for her intervention there. That did clear some things up for me, and I appreciate that when it comes to regulation. But I did have concerns about how those regulations will in turn be reverted into EU regulations. And on section 6, in specific to importation of settlement goods, it's part 1 that I had the query on the Minister when you come back in later on at the stage. You might just clarify, I suppose, how to appeal any of those offences. Do they go to the European Court of Justice, or if it's found guilty by the Irish courts on foot of this bill, where does the appeal go to, and what's the limitation of that thereof?
Thank you, BlacKKK's. Just a couple of points that are important to make here. First of all, it is important, despite interruption earlier, that I get it said that we are part of existing EU actions and that we support all EU actions in relation to disputes around the world, and we are part of the actions in relation to the Crimea. We're part of the actions in relation to Palestine. That's an important point. And the other point that is also important is there's an onus on government. Despite the fact that Senator Norris makes earlier, there is an onus on government, and it's generally the case that government accepts the legal advice of its Attorney General and its Attorney General's office, and that is the advice in this instance. There is also the point that it's the view, and I know maybe I should wait till the end to say this last career. I'll wait till we're the summing up speeches for the latter parts, the other few points. But basically, it's the AG's view, and the legal advice to government here is that on this, the legal advice to government is that we stand liable to actions and class actions on this.
Not at the moment, no. Thank you very much. Section 6. Does Section 6 stand part of the bill? Agreed. Thank you.
Not agreed.
Oh, not agreed, sorry. Question is that Section 6 stand part of the bill. Those in favour say Taw. Those against say Neil. I think the question is carried. Okay. Section 7. Does Section 7 stand part of the bill? Agreed. Agreed. Section 8. Does Section 8 stand part of the bill? Agreed. Section 9. Does Section 9 stand part of the bill? Agreed. Section 10. Does Section 9, Senator Richmond.
Again, sorry, I did have my hand up. Section 9.
Section 9.
And for your information, I will have a further point on Section 11 in reference to Part A, just when you come to it. No, in Section 9, and I think it's Part 1, it mentions territorial waters. And I would ask the Minister if he could, in his summing up, differentiate between inland waters and offshore waters, and where claims over those waters are disputed. How would that be arbitrated under international law? Thank you very much, Gaelic.
I think I should remind senators that there will be no summing up today. We're dealing with sections on a committee stage. Summing up will be coming when we come fifth stage. Okay. Section 9. Did Section 9 stand part of the bill? Agreed? Agreed. Section 10. Did Section 10 stand part of the bill? Agreed? Agreed. Section 11. Did Section 11 stand part of the bill? Agreed? Section Senator Mulhern. And 11.
Just to say to you, when this bill was previously before the Senate, business cut short early, and I didn't get a chance to speak. And I just want to speak against the bill, and it is pertinent to Section 11. Yes?
You're quite in order.
Yeah. Okay. I'd just like to say that I want to speak against the bill. I'd like to say that we had Minister Coveney here before, and I would like to support him in his position on this. He's very genuine in his ambition to contribute towards the cause of peace in the Middle East. Show some respect. Firstly, so I don't agree with this bill. Firstly, this bill is not lawful. International
offences against charges under the bill.
Yes, and I'm talking about lawfulness here.
And offences. Okay.
Well, it's over to you, Chairman. I didn't get an opportunity before.
I'm very sorry. I probably wasn't in the chair for that. There's nothing I can do about that, Senator. Sorry, but carry on.
Yeah.
And be as brief and succinct as you can.
I'll try and be. Firstly, this bill is not lawful. International trade is an exclusive competence of the European Union. So ultimately, this bill, which may be well-intentioned, is futile. And further, the Minister has described how the passing of this bill will actually hinder his work for peace. He has stated that Irish action of this nature would isolate and marginalise Ireland's voice and influence on the question of Palestine at EU level, which is the place where we can do the most good for Palestinians. We should listen to him. He has a broad view and meets and listens to all parties. Human suffering and misery, which is evident in the settlements, cannot be condoned, but I don't believe this bill is going to help. The history of Israel, of the Jewish people and of the Arab people is very complex. Each side feels full moral justification in their views and actions. That's because they operate from completely different cultures and paradigms as to how they got to the situation they are in today. We should guard against jumping in with our solutions as though we know best. We need to listen carefully to both sides and call out both sides for the part they are playing in ensuring this conflict goes on and on. We need to facilitate a conversation towards peace that will be meaningful for both. Peace and the means to find a way to coexist can only be found, I'm just concluding, from Arabs and Jews themselves, not from outsides. As outsiders, which we are, we should be facilitating this conversation, should be our focus. Just like what happened in the north of our country, have we not learnt? This bill can negatively impact on the channels of communication and trust between the Minister, the Irish Government and Israel. I'm just concluding now, Cathaoirleach. A number of people here today might feel better if this bill is passed, but the conflict is bigger than settlements, and this bill is just skirting around core obstacles which need to be faced internationally. Let us not throw oil on the fire of conflict in the Middle East here today.
It's a second stage speech, but thank you. Senator Alice Mary Higgins, I'm calling them in order. Senator Alice Mary Higgins.
Simply just to very quickly to clarify, I would have to take issue with the question of the unlawfulness. I think we've been very clear. There are different legal opinions. We haven't seen the legal opinion of the Attorney General, but Michael Lynn,
defences against charges.
And the specific issue, and the reason I wish to say that it's important to say this bill is very, very careful in law, is we have also indicated, and I think it has been that we would be open to report stage amendments, which others have spoken about, to perhaps take even further cognizance of EU court rulings in respect of the laws in this area. Again, the opinion that we have had from Mr Takis is the opinion that has been given, advice has been given to the International Court of Justice. We are internationalists as well as being, and our peace-building role gives us a responsibility to uphold international law.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Richmond.
Thank you very much, BlacKKK's, and I'll speak very briefly on this section 11. And my point, as opposed to question, I apologise for that slip up earlier on, relates specifically to 11b and the differentiation between settler within occupied territory, and it's a concern I'd like to raise at this stage, and perhaps, as has been suggested by others, amendments might be forthcoming at the next stage of this legislation. And I just think within this bill there's an element of vagueness when it comes to the occupied territory. We understand you could draw that on a map and it can be read, but the definition of a settler, and this is where it moves away from, I suppose, the specific region of Israel and Palestine, and the point has been very well made by both the bill's proponent and others that this isn't specific to this region. I respect that and fully appreciate it, but I do want to again bring back the comparison which I raised earlier in relation particularly to Crimea and Odessa and the ongoing situation between Ukraine and Russia. And how do you define a settler when some would deny that persons going into that region aren't settlers? Maybe they're an invading force, or the others are in denial that they're in existence. And I think it requires this bill to provide a bit more depth in settler. Is it a good or service produced by a settler? And when we look at modern technology, is that settler producing that service remotely or within the territory in itself? It's something that I think could be tightened up in the next stage, and I might come back with amendments in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Mary-Louise O'Donnell.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach. I just want to point out to my colleague, Senator Mulhern, that I am not an outsider when it comes to human rights. And I didn't come in here to be an outsider when it came to human rights. I came in here to be a speaker for human rights. Well said. Here, here. So don't ever stand up and tell me and accuse me of being an outsider. That's not what I am. And that's what the upper house of this Parliament is. Legislative House and a House of Human Rights. So don't ever speak like that about your fellow senators again, Senator Mulhern.
Minister, do you wish to comment at this stage? No? No, thank you. Section 11. Section 11 stand part of the bill. Agreed? Agreed. Not agreed. Who said not agreed? Not agreed. Senator Richmond, not agreed. The question is that it stand part of the bill. Those in favour say "Tá." Those against say "Níl." I think it's carried. Carried. Thank you. Jeez, I wanted the title now. Yeah. Okay. That this be the title to the bill, an act to give effect to the state's obligations arising under the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war and under customary international humanitarian law, and for that purpose to make it an offence for a person to import or sell goods or services originating in an occupied territory, or to extract resources from an occupied territory in certain circumstances, and to provide for related matters. Is the title agreed? Not agreed. Not agreed. The question is that the title be agreed. Those in favour say Tá. Those against say Níl. I think the question is carried. Vote all. Thank you. Control of Economic Activity, Occupied Territories Bill 2018 Committee Stage title. The question is that the title be agreed to, and on that question a division has been challenged. Tellers Tá, Senator Francis Black and Senator Alice Mary Higgins. Níl, Senator John O'Mahony and Senator Joe O'Reilly. And the division will take place now. 1 minute. Bill reported without amendment. Can I ask Senator Black when is it proposed to take the next stage?
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, thank you. Is that agreed?
Why not now? Because the House hasn't ordered it.
The House hasn't ordered it. Be respectful now. You're a long-time senator. You should know better. Next Tuesday, that agreed?
You can order it now.
Agreed. Thank you. Order, please, order. When's it proposed to sit again, Leader?
Thank
Thank you. Agreed? Agreed. Thank you all.